Hi, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the 2023 Student Ethics Symposium. I'm Elena Sapp, and I'm the Research Assistant and Student Fellow at the Center. Today, I'll pass over to, excuse me, I'm having the same problem. Feedback, all right. But I'll pass over to David Scott, who's a communications professor at UVU, who will introduce the students. So David, to you.
Oh, thank you very much. I am really honored to have these students here with us today. I do want to make one minor correction. Matthew is actually a political science major. He attended my First Amendment class last semester, and I thought he would have a lot of good things to add to this based on our conversations in class. Audrey and Halen are both communication majors, and I've had them or have them in my classes now. They're both outstanding students, and I'm really honored to have them present today. And I just want to also share that, Matthew, don't feel too bad. They didn't just get you wrong. I'm actually a full professor, not an associate professor. So we made some mistakes, but it's okay. We'll fix all that live.
How dare they?
So we'll go in order of Audrey first, and then Matthew, and then Halen. So looking forward to hearing what you each have to say.
Okay, thank you so much, Brother Dave. So the name of the panel is Who Will Censor Whom? And we're focusing on some of the different aspects of interacting with and consuming social media. I'm personally going to be talking about some of the theoretical aspects of how we go about our social media consumption, specifically from the framing of the third-person effects theory. Now, this theory predicts that individuals will perceive media messages to have greater effects on other people than on themselves. So if you ever see an advertisement for, say, Nike shoes and think to yourself, well, I'm not going to spend money on those shoes because I'm smart enough to not let advertising get to me, but I can see why it would interest other people. And then you promptly lace up your Adidas, you are a perfect example of that theory in action. And while advertising is a relatively harmless example of the third-person effects theory in practice, there are some much more alarming instances of the effect causing people to take dramatic action when it comes to messages spread on social media. One behavioral hypothesis predicts that third-person perception, such as, or i.e. seeing others as more easily influenced, will lead to support for restrictions on media messages, i.e. censorship. And we've all seen these headlines on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, wherever you get your social media fix, that we detect almost instantly as being partially, if not completely false. The question that some communications researchers have is, what do people think the effects of the spread of misinformation is having on others and their community? Earlier this year, UK researchers Sasha Altay and Alberto Acerbi explored this question in a study they published under the title, People Think Misinformation is a Threat Because They Assume Others Are Gullible. They did two studies, one in the UK and one in the US, and they discovered that 77% of participants believed that people in general were more vulnerable to misinformation than themselves, and only 18% believed that they were more vulnerable to misinformation than people in general. And I don't know about you, I'm trying to do that math in my head. It's just not adding up, right? People thinking that they are smarter or at least more clever than the general population isn't new. But the thing that the study discovered that is interesting to note is that the participants who were more concerned about the spread of misinformation were themselves more likely to spread articles with alarmist headlines about the spread of misinformation. And here's the kicker. Most of these alarmist articles, the ones that said the spread of misinformation is a threat to democracy and it's the worst thing to ever happen to our society and we need to stop all of this, those articles are generally the ones that have misinformation about misinformation in them. So why is this an issue? Well, the first issue to take into account is the concern that the spread of misinformation is a threat to democracy. When enough people, or a few people with loud enough voices, raise concerns about the spread of misinformation, governments see it as an opportunity to start introducing censorship laws. The UK, France, Australia, India, Germany, Brazil, and many other countries have already tried to introduce laws and policies combating fake news. Epistemologist David Cody has asked many times in recent years, what even is fake news, though? And how do we determine it in an objective way? If we're going to try to crack down on fake news and censor it, what are the criteria for fake news? If a news article is 75% accurate and 25% made up, do we censor the entire article? And what if it's 95% accurate and the other 5% is simply a miscommunication of facts between the source and journalist? Does the 5% then qualify the whole article as fake news, and do we remove the entire piece? Cody has posited that the term fake news doesn't even refer to something that actually exists. If we try to define the term, we end up getting really close to the definitions of conspiracy theory or even heresy. And personally, I'm inclined to agree with Cody. The term is, in itself, almost oxymoronic. News is supposed to be the reporting of events that are actually happening. So if we say that something is fake news, doesn't that just make it a fictional story? The second issue that we're facing is that being objective is impossible. If you listened to the previous panel before ours, we know that all of the information that's out there has some sort of bias. The panel was on AI and how it takes thousands of points of information, and each of those points of information have some sort of bias. Even our most trusted reporters and news outlets have some sort of bias. The danger when it comes to third-person effects is when we fail to identify the bias in ourselves. In 2020, researchers Tully, Vraga, and Smithson ran a study where they discovered that even though people are aware they have personal bias, when reading a news article, they are more likely to blame the media outlet, advertisers, and individual journalists for bias in a story than their own interpretation of the story. The articles that the participants read were about the drought in California, and given that none of the participants were residents of the state, the idea was that each article should have a fairly neutral effect on those that read them. What the researchers found, however, is that those that were more left-leaning were more critical about the article from Fox News, while those that were right-leaning had less trust in the accuracy of the information in the article from the New York Times. Both articles were factual. It's really, I mean, you can try to put a bias on an article about the drought in California, but as far as the researchers were concerned, the content of these articles were almost identical. But because of the individuals who read these articles, because of their own personal biases, they were more likely to think that the source of the news had an angle. Oh, and remember a few minutes ago when I said that we've all had instances of seeing fake news headlines and being able to identify them immediately? Here's issue number 3. Research has shown that people are actually so bad at identifying misinformation that they would have a better chance of flipping a coin and saying, heads it's real, tails it's false, than being left to identify misinformation on their own. In 2018, researchers in Indiana and Hawaii conducted a study that showed that out of 83 participants, only 17% of them were better than chance at identifying fake news, and only 1 out of the 83 participants could actually identify fake news more than 60% of the time. So when the issue is how we define what exactly misinformation is and how bias in the media comes just as much from ourselves as it does from the source, what is it we're supposed to do? One of the first things that we can do is we can increase media literacy in schools from a younger age. A study in 2022 by Diana Amaya discovered that actually teens are very aware that social media isn't a great source of reliable news. The problem isn't that they're believing the first headlines they come across. The problem is that they're searching for ways to verify the information and don't know how to tell the difference between what is fact and what is fiction. We're currently in an age where the average young person has never had the need to pick up a physical newspaper to get the news, and instead can get all the information that they need from the internet. It's more important than ever to actually acknowledge that information can come from a wide variety of sources so that we can teach kids how to look at search results and not feel overwhelmed and confused by the different options they have. Teach our population how to ask who wrote this and why. Who is the target audience? And when you're asking who that target audience is, acknowledge when you are the target audience. And this brings me to the next and most important thing that we can do, which is look inward and maybe admit to yourself that you are not as clever as you think you are. The thing is, third person effects can be secretly sinister in that it looks like helpfulness. It's people saying, oh, I want to help other people understand better. But in reality is actually a way to blame other people for the way things are, especially when things seem bad. By asking ourselves what we are vulnerable to and where our biases are, we can actually start to spread good. Thank you, and I'll turn the time over to Matthew.
Thank you, Audrey. That was really incredible stuff there. I think I've got some good notes to build off of you on that. For those of you folks who don't know me, my name is Matthew Drachman. As Brother Dave was saying, I'm a political science major. I concentrate in American government, and I minor in communications and constitutional studies. And the thing I want to sort of touch on today is a little bit about the First Amendment and the issues that are pertaining to social media and how that will affect things in the long run. So I'm going to quickly share my screen with you real quick. Get these slides up here. In the meantime, I want you guys to start thinking to yourselves, what is speech? What do you imagine when you think of speech? Think about that for a moment.
The slides are up. You're just muted, Matthew.
There we go. That should fix it. Perfect. Okay, so social media. Let's talk a little bit about it. The public square, or is it private property, right? So, like I said, just sort of introducing myself a little bit. Fun fact about me, I love the Kentucky Derby. It's the Super Bowl at my house, so the next coming months are going to be very fun. But what do you think of? What is it you think of when you think of free speech? Do you think of the soapbox? Do you think of protesters? Do you think of speakers? Do you think of symbolic things of speech? Were any of you thinking of the internet? Like your Facebook posts or your social media posts? We are currently living in a time and age where you can reach millions of people with a simple click of a button on your phone. Steve Jobs didn't imagine this when he first made the iPhone, but back in this day and age, we are currently living in an age of communication and truth. We can communicate onto two different sides of the globe by just simply tweeting out something. This has been a subject to many different debates over the past few years, especially with President Trump here recently. So I want to sort of give you guys a sort of a visual representation of what the common law has been like around what speech looks like on the internet. So this first green bar here represents the bar that the men's basketball team has set for themselves next year. No, I'm just joking. Don't worry about that. But this line here represents 234 years of history for the United States. By the time the new U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1789, right, till now, to 2023. 234 years of common law history, and that's completely excluding the years and years of English thought, of European thought, or world thought when it has come to free speech, what that idea looks like. This next bar represents the first time where a standardized way of computers to communicate with each other were established. That is the amount of time there, about 34 years. This next bar here represents when the first modern social media platforms, a platform called Six Figures, was first implemented back in 1997. That's when the year my brother was born. This last bar right here represents the first time Steve Jobs, right, comes out with the iPhone, exponentially growing the usage tenfold of social media. And that is just a small sliver of the overall experience we have of what the common law looks like when we apply it to speech on the internet. Very short. We're on a new frontier. You know, it's often said about our generation that we were born too late to have explored the world and born far too early to explore the stars. But where we sit right now is a pinnacle point of our history, because from what we decide now, what we decide the common law and the precedents to be is how we will be operating in the future. Though we may not be able to explore the stars, our children and our children's children will be using the precedents that we set here with speech on the internet far, far into the future. And it's something we should be considering as a society. So just to give you an idea of what social media usage is looking like, right now, as we stand, in 2021, Pew Research found that almost 72% of American adults use social media. It's becoming a common part of our everyday routines. We pick up our phone and we check out what's going on. Some people use this to stay in contact with their friends from high school. Some people use this to stay in contact with various different college buddies. Many of you may have LinkedIn to stay in contact with your professional associates. But this is undeniably a very essential part of American everyday life. And we're still trying to figure out what that will look like in the future. Because keep in mind, this is just a blink of an eye in this complete expanse of history of this country. So let's go into this. What is the foundation for speech to be laid for social media and the internet? And what are the perspectives that we can sort of see at the moment in time? Because right now there are several different perspectives of what social media is and should be versus how it's practiced and enacted. Because keep in mind, social media isn't something that is controlled by the government at the moment, right? Hopefully not, right? The thing at the moment is that many of these things are established through companies. So Facebook, Meta, these are companies that establish these places of public square. So we have to recognize, we're trying to decide, is this the public square or is this private property? So I want to give you guys a few Supreme Court cases that I think are probably be important to sort of establish the current perspectives on what we see social media to be and how we want it to be perceived. So the first one I give you here is Miami Herald v. Toronto. This is a case where a politician sued the Miami Herald for a piece that was written about him, and he wasn't allowed to respond within their newspaper, given equal coverage, as it were. The court essentially decided that the Miami Herald wasn't obligated to give him that equal coverage, as it'd be a violation of the First Amendment rights, thus establishing that publishers aren't obligated to publish something. Now, that word publisher is going to be important later. Now, Reno v. ACLU in 1997 established that the First Amendment applies to internet communications and the varieties of that sort of case. Elemis v. US started to explore the certain limits of speech online when a man posted several different disconcerting social media posts about his wife and local schools. And this one more recently is actually very recent. The Mahoney Area School District VBL. This was involved a cheerleader at a high school who posted on social media her, how do I put this in a good way that I don't have to swear? Let's see here. Essentially, she was dissatisfied with the results of her high school cheer team selection process, and the school district sanctioned her, suspended her, and she took this all the way up to the Supreme Court, saying it was a violation of her First Amendment rights, and the court decided 8-1 that this was protected. The reason this case is significant is because it occurred on social media. So you start to see the common law start to be formed around what the First Amendment looks like on social media. But keep this in mind. All the cases that I show you here apply to one particular body, and that is the government. Government cannot come in and do these things. The Bill of Rights only protects you from the government. The Bill of Rights does not protect you from actions from private companies. And so the question I wish to pose to you is this. These platforms become so essential, so integral to communication and to everyday life. As we were seeing with the statistics before, 72% of American adults use social media. When does it become the public square? If so many people are using it, when does it become the public square, and when does it, or does it still remain that private property? That is currently the debate that is trying to be settled with various different actions that have been going on. And there are two main perspectives that we should probably cover. The first is the public square point of view. So you start to see this, maybe some of you have heard about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. President Trump recently tried to launch Truth Social for First Amendment issues, and so forth. This point of view values the unrestricted speech on all parts of the internet. Many of who take this view is something that is absolute against the government and oftentimes should be applied to companies. Because the worry is, if a company disfavors a certain point of view, then they can make sure that their point of view is the one that's being broadcasted. And to sort of what Avery was saying about how people are sort of worried about misinformation, people are worried about the gullibility of certain people, right? The same is true with the public square point of view. People are worried that these companies are trying to broadcast and to propagate a certain narrative while restricting other points of speech. That is one particular view. But from the company's point of view, you get this point of view, the product view. Now, social media is not cheap. Everyone has to pay for it. Meta is $1 billion company. These public squares require maintenance just as much as your local public community center would require maintenance to maintain, and that's through tax dollars. But these are private ventures. These are private places that private companies and private individuals are staking their own risk in order to maintain and make money off of. Now, it doesn't cost money to go onto Facebook, otherwise you probably wouldn't use it. But the way they make their money is through advertisement. You are the product, as it were. And it's a service that they provide to you in order to use the platform, to share things and to keep in touch with your friends, right? Think of it as sort of like a modern day version of the Telegram, right? You pay somebody to send the message, but in this case, you're just being given advertisements that they have a private contract with. And so with that view in mind, it is the view of many of these companies like Meta that they can go in and regulate speech that they are not particularly favored to, or could cause certain risks to their company and to their advertisers, because advertisers don't necessarily want to be plastered onto a viewpoint that isn't necessarily to their own liking. And that is their First Amendment right through Citizens v. United. And so let's talk a little bit about a few case studies that are actually rather interesting, because right now as we speak, there are two major cases that are going on within our U.S. Congress, and one fairly recently that happened in the Utah State Legislature. And so right now, keep that question in mind. What precedent do you want set for your posterity? Because that is the most crucial question here. So let's talk about the Tik Tok ban. So essentially what's going on, if you haven't heard about it, is that the current worry of the U.S. Congress is that there is a national security risk towards TikTok. Now, TikTok is owned by a company called ByteDance. ByteDance is a subsidiary of a Chinese company. And the worry is that the data that is being collected on by TikTok from its users, it's 150 million US users, is currently being transferred to that company ByteDance and then being shared with the Chinese Communist Party of China. And that is where this whole thing begins. Because the worry is that they're collecting data on, say, US service members or US politicians to conduct espionage. And so the point has been made to say perhaps we should regulate TikTok or to ban it entirely. And there are two main camps to this. One camp is essentially saying, like CEO Xiao Chu is saying here, that it's a violation of First Amendment freedoms. Essentially, the company's product is being ousted and targeted by the U.S. Congress as opposed to all the other social media companies out there that are American owned. and that is a violation of speech. Now, the interesting part about that is that is a very uncommon argument to make from a company's point of view, because at this point, they have stayed within the product view of their ability to regulate social media. And so with both of these cases that I'm about to show you, you see a flip into what people are saying of who can regulate and who can't. But you'll notice that you see a government entity coming in and trying to regulate something that many Americans are using while saying that is a threat to certain things. So you have to ask, does this qualify as to something that can be regulated, and does the First Amendment apply here? Or is it a product issue that the US Congress has every right to regulate under the Commerce Clause? Now, this one is more at home. So recently, 2 bills were passed in the Utah State Legislature and signed into law by Governor Cox. And this was SB 152 and HB 311. This was a part of a initiative by the state legislature and the governor's office to try and regulate social media and how it pertains to minors within the state. And it's currently the strictest laws that have been passed thus far, because currently 2 states are, including Texas, are currently considering banning social media usage by minors entirely. And so this is what these 2 bills do. So SB 152 requires that social media companies verify age and to obtain consent from parents for minors wanting to open new accounts. It also prohibits certain functions for minor accounts, like messaging certain accounts. You can't advertise to them, and they can't collect information at all. And one of the other interesting aspects of this bill was that it asks companies to regulate time for minors that are being spent on social media, particularly between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. This is a provision that was trying to be put in place because they were worried of insomnia. Now, the other bill, HB 311, which both of these bills are probably going to be challenged in court. They don't go into effect until about May 6th of this year. But this bill is sort of interesting. It tries to prohibit social media companies from using a design or feature that causes a minor to have an addiction to the company's platform. Now, this is an essential component because remember, when you use social media, you're the product. They want you to stay on there so you see more ads so they make more money. So many of these platforms use algorithms to show you posts or anything else that will try to keep you on the app. It's how some people stay on there for hours and hours and hours. And there's an argument that these things are addictive. And especially to a minor's brain, the argument is that this is something that can be harmful and damaging to a developing mind. Now, that's the argument that they make. However, this bill here tries to ban that certain component within social media, which could lead to one of 2 things. One, there's very different apps that are being offered inside of Utah as opposed to outside the state. Or 2, they just don't have people download it in the state of Utah altogether, just to abide by the law. And so that's the current situation you're dealing with, is whether or not these bills are violating First Amendment rights of users or attempting to regulate the commerce right of companies to regulate their platforms, or to the commerce right of Congress or the legislature to regulate these certain apps and companies. And so bringing this all full circle, ask yourself something. Because remember, this generation is the one that will set precedents for years to come, especially with how little common law or little experience we have had with internet and the social media being looked at and legislated upon for future generations. The precedents we set here and now will determine whether or not those precedents, what precedents and what practices we will be using for generations, just as much as the ideas were first coming out about the printing press, the first common practices of speech. This is much as a developing thing now as it will be in the future. And so with that, I will leave you with that. I'll pass the time over. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right. Thank you, Matthew. Here, let me share my screen really quick. Let's Let's see. All right, let me go here. So I was asked to present on specifically hate speech on social media and the ethical and legal issues that it has. So I will very much be building off of what Matthew talked about as far as censorship goes and how companies regulate it and things like that. So just as a brief introduction to who I am, I've been lucky enough to have the privilege to work in the media realm for the past couple of years. My first media job, I worked for a magazine called Nugent Good News. It was part of a PR campaign for a wealth management company, and I got to write stories and highlight nonprofits and human interest stories, and it was a lot of fun. I currently don't do that anymore, but right now I have two jobs in the media. I work for a national company called Cumulus Media, and they own 5 radio stations here in Utah. And I'm a part-time DJ on one of their stations, K-Bear 101. And I also help with their promotions. And then I also do social media marketing for Holiday Oil. I just recently started there a few months ago. This is a picture of me at their newest store opening in Saratoga. I felt like a little kid at Disneyland because I got to meet the Coca-Cola polar bear, which was pretty freaking awesome if you ask me. But anyway, so that's who I am. Hopefully that gives me a little bit more authority to speak on the issue. But before we even go into what social media is doing with hate speech, we kind of have to define what hate speech is. And that's where things get tricky, because different people and different social media companies define hate speech differently. Okay, so this is what Facebook defines it as. They say hate speech is a direct attack against people rather than concepts or institutions on the basis of what we call protected characteristics: race, ethnicity, national origin, disability, religious affiliation, caste, sexual orientation, sex, gender identity, and serious disease. Okay, and so they have it as a direct attack. Well, a direct attack is what they say is a violent or dehumanizing speech, harmful stereotypes, statements of inferiority, expressions of contempt, disgust or dismissal, cursing, and calls for exclusion or segregation. Okay, so that's according to Facebook's community standards. When you sign their terms and agreement form, when you create a Facebook account, you are essentially saying, yeah, I will not participate in any of these posts or anything like that. So that's Facebook. Well, Twitter is somewhat similar. Okay, they define it as a direct attack also on people on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, caste, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious affiliation, age, disability, or serious disease. Okay, so very similar protected classes there. And they define attack as dehumanization, hateful references, incitement, slurs and tropes, hateful imagery, or a hateful profile. Okay, so Twitter and Facebook are relatively similar in how they define hate speech. Okay, and then when we go to YouTube, it's somewhat different. Okay, they just flat out say that it's not allowed on YouTube. Okay, and they remove content promoting violence or hatred against individuals or groups based on any of the following attributes: age, caste, disability, ethnicity, gender identity, expression, nationality, race, immigration status, religion, sex or gender, sexual orientation. And this is the two that really makes them different: victims of a major violent event and their kin, and veteran status. Okay, and this was just recently updated. It used to be that there couldn't be anything posted on YouTube that denied the Holocaust. And that was said in these YouTube policies, but then they have recently updated them to just say victims of a major violent event and their kin. So Holocaust denial falls into that, but it also, and captures a larger, more events and things in history. And then also veteran status. Facebook and Twitter did not have veteran status as a protected class, but YouTube does. So obviously it's tricky to define hate speech, and these companies define it differently. But kind of what Matthew was talking about when he was in his presentation, many people wonder, well, don't I have freedom of speech? Can't I say whatever I want on social media? And well, social media companies, like Matthew said, are not owned and operated by the government. The First Amendment only protects free speech from government regulation and not private regulation. And social media companies are not owned or operated by the government. Okay. But with that, there are also things that the First Amendment just doesn't protect, even with the government regulation. Imminent threats are not protected by the First Amendment, and hate speech and imminent threats can be different. Imminent threats are, can be hate speech, but they're also threats, and hate speech doesn't have to be a threat. And then also with that, hate speech and offensive language are different. Something can be totally offensive, but not hate speech. And something could be hate speech and offensive, right? And so social media companies want to remove hate speech. They don't necessarily want to remove offensive language. Okay, so let's get into that. So what's an imminent threat? Okay, one of the biggest cases, there's a lot of cases that help define what an imminent threat is, but one of the biggest cases that went to the Supreme Court in Brandenburg v. Ohio, basically, as a little background of the case, some racist douchebag was basically having this get together at his house. He was a member of the KKK, said all this racist stuff, said that they needed to take action against the government if the government wasn't going to protect white supremacy, all this horrible stuff, right? And then afterwards, they probably had a couple hot dogs, hamburgers, and everybody went home, right? So no imminent lawless action came from his speech. But he was still arrested in Ohio, because in Ohio at the time, there was a law that said that you couldn't say anything that could lead to violence, basically. Okay, that's the basic premise of that law. And so I went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court stroked that law down and basically said, look, he was not inciting imminent lawless action, even though he said all these horrible things, all this hate speech and racist, stuff. It wasn't inciting imminent lawless action. Okay. And a big part of that was because after he said all those things, nothing happened, right? Everybody went home and there wasn't any lawless action that happened right after. And it was not likely to incite lawless action in the future. Okay. So even though hate speech is horrible, it doesn't mean that it's an imminent threat and that it's not protected by the First Amendment. Okay. And then with that comes offensive language. One of the Supreme Court cases that helps define what offensive language is Cohen v. California. And at the time, California had a law that basically was an overarching law that said that, if you had or said anything that was disorderly conduct, then you could be arrested and whatever. And so Paul Cohen was a department store worker, 19 years old, and he had a jacket, and on the jacket it said "fuck the draft," right? And he was arrested because it was disorderly conduct based off of this law. And I went to the Supreme Court, and essentially the Supreme Court said just because something's offensive doesn't mean that you can regulate it, right? If something's offensive, you can just look away. You don't have to be offended by it. The First Amendment does not protect, your right to not be offended, right? And so when it comes to offensive language and social media, things get tricky as well. Okay. So in social media, they have these algorithms, and for the most part, they do a pretty decent job at detecting hate speech. Okay. They go through and find these certain words or labels that are used more for offensive speech versus hate speech, and so some words might only be used for offensive speech. And so when those get red flagged or whatever by the algorithm, usually they let them go through and be posted because they're mostly used for offensive speech. And then other labels mostly get used for hate speech. But then there's words that are a little bit more tricky than that. So like the word bitch can be used offensively, but it could also be used in a hate speech way. Like you could literally post a photo of your dog named Rosie and call her a bitch, right? And use the literal definition of it. Is it offensive? Yeah, I'm sure people will get offended by it, but it's not hate speech. And then your racist, misogynistic uncle could post something horrible and hateful on social media and use the word bitch, and it's hate speech, right? And so these algorithms try to find these words that would immediately red flag that something's hate speech, but it's trickier than that. Okay. And then obviously with all of these algorithms and efforts that social media tries to use to get rid of hate speech, then there's still hate speech on social media, right? You still see it. And so social media basically uses 3 steps to try and curb hate speech from appearing on their platforms. The first step is editorial review, which is essentially just describing in their terms and conditions what they define hate speech as, okay? And then it's automatic detection after that. So the algorithms trying to find those words, trying to find certain red flags that pop up in the algorithm that can indicate that a hateful post is going to be posted and it doesn't even get out on the feed, right? Okay, but as we've seen, that can be tricky. And so things still come through and get posted. So their third measure is community flagging. Other users of Facebook or social media go through and flag content that they find to be hate speech, and it gets reviewed. Well, research has found that only about 47% of those reported hate speech content and posts get removed. Okay, so still just a little over half of those are, remain. And a big reason for that is the people who regulate and go through and review flagged content are poorly paid. It's almost like the position at like Facebook and Twitter to go through and review those things, like that position is looked down upon. Like if you get demoted from a high level position at Facebook to the community flagging department, like you're totally looked down upon. And these people are treated horribly. They have long hours. Their mental state is messed up because they're just looking at hate speech all day, right? And so it's almost impossible, humanly impossible, to go through and like adequately screen all of these hateful comments and get rid of all the hate speech. Okay. But going along with that, just to backtrack, even though Facebook allows offensive language still to come through and not hate speech, it's in their absolute right as a private company, if they wanted to even regulate offensive language. They can do whatever they want as a private company to meet the missions and goals of their company and to please stakeholders and shareholders. I think that in my personal opinion, I think that they try to limit as much censorship as possible on their platforms, but so they do allow offensive language, but I understand why they wouldn't allow hate speech, because they do have shareholders they need to please, they do have stakeholders, and those stakeholders don't want to be associated with a social media platform if it's known for just being a hateful place, right, to post things, right? So to me, that makes sense. But like I was saying, they're private, okay? And they can regulate however they want. But hate speech is still present on those social media platforms. And so how do we adequately regulate and combat hate speech? Well, do we censor it? Well, absolutely not. Like, in my opinion, you shouldn't censor hate speech, right? That will not do any good to helping to combat the ideas that hate speech has. And so when it comes to social media companies censoring hate speech, that's a little bit of a different type of censorship than the government censoring hate speech, right? And so if your racist uncle posts something hateful on social media, you can flag it, absolutely. But probably one of the best ways to combat his hateful comments is to throw more free speech at him, right? And to critique his ideas and have a discussion with him, invite him to have a drink, discuss their ideas, try to see where he's coming from, and see if you could even convince him to not have those hateful thoughts, right? And then one of my favorite ways to combat hate speech is just to be silent. Most people who post these outrageous things on social media that get through the algorithms, they just want to create arouse, right? They just want people to get upset with them. They want clout. They want to have arguments and things like that with the people that follow them. And so if they don't get a single like or comment on their post, well, then they just made themselves look like an idiot, right? And it's going to piss them off even more. And they didn't get what they want out of that post. Okay. One of my favorite activists currently to help with hate speech is this man named Daryl Davis. And he's a musician. And back, when he was touring the South, he was asked to play at this white bar. Okay. And essentially only KKK members went to this bar, and so he played this bar. And after he played, a person confronted him and said, hey, I didn't even know a black man could play like Jerry Lee Lewis. Right. And Daryl's like, well, Jerry Lee Lewis learned from black people, right? That's where he was influenced by. And so they had this discussion about, the black influence of music in that genre. And this man confronted him and said, hey, I'm actually a member of the KKK. And, he became best friends with this person. Eventually, this man left the Klan, mainly inspired by his friendship with Daryl Davis. And, this inspired Davis to write a book about Klansmen and their point of view. And so he went through this guy that he met at this bar to interview more Klansmen. And he even got to interview National Klans leaders and befriend these people because of having conversations with them and trying to understand them, treating them like a human being. And he has directly led to 60 to 80 Klansmen to leave the Klan, while indirectly helping 200 Klansmen to leave. So when he would befriend these national leaders of the Klan and they would leave, these national leaders would basically go to all of their followers and describe why he left. And a lot of his followers would leave with him. Okay. And he has this great quote. He says, what I've come to find to be the greatest and most effective and successful weapon that we can use known to man to combat such adversaries as ignorance, racism, hatred, violence is also the least expensive weapon and the one that is the least used by Americans. And that weapon is called communication. Okay. This man is incredible. He's been on NPR. He's been on Joe Rogan. You can look up his book. But as a black man, he is incredibly brave to befriend these Klansmen. But he's right. The only way we combat hateful ideas is to have a discussion and really get to know these people, and to treat them as human beings. But anyway, that's my presentation. Thank you for your time. I hope that helps give a good look at some of the legal and ethical issues of hate speech on social media. So thank you.
Well, thank you both or all of you for your presentations. We're out of time, unfortunately, for questions. But hopefully, and I think our time automatically ends at 11:50, but now I'm just talking to you. Thank you guys for presenting, and I respect all of you as a student. I definitely, thought all your presentations were very professional and good, and I hope to do things like that. So yeah, thank you.